NATO's foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels to discuss how the alliance can maintain peace and stability at a time of increasing tension with Moscow. On the agenda will be not only Russian involvement in Ukraine, but also the build-up of missiles and troops along Europe's eastern border. Ahead of today's session, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg suggested if both sides tone down their rhetoric, it might take some of the heat out of the situation. Let's hear what he had to say.
I welcome any toning down of the rhetoric because I think words matters, and less aggressive rhetoric can be a first step towards also a better dialogue. At the same time, words matters, but of course deeds matters even more. Therefore, the important thing is what we see, what kind of actions we see from the Russian side.
Jens Stoltenberg. And we're joined now by the Conservative MP Daniel Kawczynski, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome to the Daily Politics. First of all, though, Tim Montgomerie, there is evidently concern amongst the Baltic states, understandably because of where they are geographically, about the Russian threat. Is any talk of a new Cold War an exaggeration?
I don't think so. If you look at some of Russia's tactics that they're deploying in the region, how they used undercover troops to invade eastern Ukraine, how they are involved in destabilizing democracies around the world. Their interference confirmed by intelligence agencies in America in the US election, involved in the WikiLeaks controversy over Hillary Clinton's emails. On a whole range of fronts, Russia is reverting to the behaviour that comes naturally to Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin was trained as a KGB agent, and I'm afraid you can't always teach an old dog new tricks. He's still behaving as he did in the past.
Yes, and how do you deal with a power that behaves in that way? There is no evidence to back up that Vladimir Putin is moving towards some sort of cordial relationship with Europe, for example.
Well, I think Jens Stoltenberg, the clip that you played from Jens Stoltenberg, is extremely important. I met him, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee met with him at the European Parliament recently, and I asked him, how are you going to, as Secretary General of NATO, how are you going to lower tensions with Russia? And he talked to us about his experience when he was Prime Minister of Norway, a NATO country which borders Russia. He had, in that position as Prime Minister of Norway, a very pragmatic and a very effective policy of dealing with Russia on a bilateral basis. And I very much hope that he will use that experience to try to lower tensions with Russia.
Sure.
He himself has said it's vitally important that despite the differences we have with them, we want to ease some of the tension that's building up.
Isn't it more than just differences? And a bilateral with Norway is one thing, but actually dealings with Russia on a whole range of issues, when it's on manoeuvres abroad, it's moving missiles closer to Europe's eastern border, it's launching cyber attacks, it's seeking to influence elections in the US and in France, makes it more difficult.
Well, I went this summer to the Polish-Russian border. That is already becoming the most highly militarized part of Europe.
Right.
If the tit-for-tat deployment of missiles continues at the pace it has been, that area of Europe will become akin to the North and South Korean border, a no man's land. And it will just take a spark to cause some sort of confrontation between the two sides. Yes, be strong and tough with them. Yes, spend more on defense. But we need to engage with them to try to build up some sort of mutual trust and respect. Otherwise, we are heading towards some sort of confrontation.
Painting Russia as the bogeyman all the time and talking about the Cold War, won't that escalate tensions? Would a different tone really, in your mind, change the balance of relations?
Well, I think Daniel officially, I think, represents Shrewsbury in Parliament, but he has more of a record, I'm afraid, for representing Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and Moscow in Russia. He's always been a spokesman and an apologist for these regimes. And his recipe of appeasement that he would like us to pursue has actually been the recipe that Barack Obama started with. If you remember, he withdrew the missile defense shield that America had promised for the Czech Republic and Poland. His Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, then reset relations with Russia. The whole message to Russia was exactly as Daniel has recommended. we sort of accommodate ourselves to Putin's aggressiveness. Since then, what Putin saw that was as a green light. He saw weakness, and he invaded Ukraine, he invaded Crimea, he blanket bombs Aleppo. And I'm afraid the kind of recipe that Daniel always wants us to recommend, to follow in the West, to be kinder and more indulgent to dictatorships, is exactly the sort of thing that inflames aggression and endangers peace rather than the reverse.
You're an apologist for a dictator.
Well, this is what the likes of Mr. Montgomerie and others and the other neocons. I was called last week by a right-wing think tank in America a Trojan horse for the Kremlin. If members of Parliament don't dovetail into this very popular narrative, which is peddled by Mr. Montgomerie and others, which is these regimes are bad, they have to be ostracized, they have to be kept away, they are going to cause problems. If anybody dares challenge that very popular and fashionable concept as to whether or not it is in our country's national strategic interest to completely ostracize these countries and not have dialogue with them.
No one's talking about completely ostracizing, Daniel. You shouldn't misrepresent the views of your critics.
His views are very, very dangerous. His views are highly dangerous.
Are they highly dangerous?
And we need to engage with Russia.
Are your views highly dangerous in the sense is what is your alternative solution to dealing with Russia? Is it containment?
Well, I think what we certainly have to be doing now is the alternative to not the kind of militarization on the borders that Daniel describes is allowing Russia to bring in their people in their green berets and hidden, essentially, Russian troops to destabilize countries like Estonia. If we do not make it absolutely clear to Russia that there will be enormous consequences for them destabilizing other parts of the world, what we will get from Putin is more of the kind of indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations that we've seen in Aleppo. Aleppo wasn't the first time, of course, that Putin bombed civilian populations. Before he came to power as Russian president in Chechnya, that is how he behaved. He is a very nasty piece of work. And when we have an apologist like Daniel for him, then we're inviting further aggression. You have dialogue, you do not have indulgence.
Can I say that I won't take any lectures from Mr. Montgomerie on this issue? I'm the only British member of Parliament to have been born in Poland, to have come from Poland. I spent my childhood listening to my grandfather about the catastrophic destruction of Poland during the Second World War, Warsaw being razed to the ground. And that left a huge indelible imprint on my mind. And all I want to do, he calls me an apologist, all I'm interested in is making sure that those frontline states that we are aligned to, countries like Poland, are not destroyed and devastated in another world war. And what is, as I've said to you, what is happening on the Kaliningrad Oblast with the Polish border is frightening. And anybody who doesn't understand the concerns of that trajectory of conflict is wrong. And may I just say lastly, a lot of people, actually, if you talk to people on the ground, whether it's in Shrewsbury or anywhere else, they expect politicians to go the extra mile to engage and to do whatever they can through diplomacy.
Yeah, but what evidence is there, Daniel Kawczynski, that that has worked? There have been attempts at dialogue, and they have been rejected in many people's minds by Vladimir Putin himself. That he is only worried about his sphere of influence, and that he feels under threat from the EU, and that is why he annexed Crimea. That is why he got himself involved in military incursion in eastern Ukraine. There is no evidence to show that Vladimir Putin is interested in anything else than increasing his sphere of influence, hence getting involved in Syria on the basis of getting rid of Islamic State.
That is the absolutely pivotal question, and we are currently on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee doing a report on Anglo-Russian relations. And may I just say to you, and we've been doing this for the last year, the report will be published in February.
But what's the evidence that he would actually respond to dialogue?
The critical evidence is this. Our policy seems to amount to confrontation and sanctions. The sanctions aren't working. Interestingly, Russian trade with America, China, Brazil and India is at record levels. So whilst we are imposing sanctions on Russia, and by the way, British companies have lost £10 billion a year as a result of these sanctions, our international competitors, the Americans, the Chinese and Brazilians, are continuing to trade. Sanctions will only work if they're implemented by all the countries in the world, not just by Western Europe.
The thing is, are you going to be out of step with your views now when we look at President Donald Trump, who, of course, has signalled friendlier relations with Russia, and Vladimir Putin. François Fillon, who is standing for the French presidency, is also quite pro-Russian, that in the end, this is a new chapter in terms of Russian relations with the rest of the world.
Well, the article I wrote for the Times that I think you were quoting, I am worried about the fact that Daniel's views are becoming more popular among certain right-wing groups. But I think we might be cuddling up to Russia at exactly the wrong moment. In the sense, if you look at the Russian economy, it's a basket case. The reason why Putin is mounting these overseas aggressions is because he's not being able to meet the economic needs of his own people. Half of the tax revenues of the Russian state really come from oil and gas. And so therefore the oil price of recent times has meant that it's been very difficult for the Russian state to be stable. So until Russia has domestic reform, it will be an unstable partner for us, and it will continue to be aggressive overseas. So actually the economic isolation is more important that we continue that, because if we don't, then Russia will be able to expand its military actions.
I mean, from a moral standpoint, is there really justification of pursuing an Anglo-Russian relationship when there are accusations of war crimes in Aleppo and Russians have been accused of protecting terrorists? I mean, is there anything to salvage from that, even if there could be improved trade, for example, between Russia and the UK?
Well, in the deepest depths of the Cold War, in 1984, we were still, when Konstantin Chernenko was the General Secretary of the Communist Party, we were still engaging with Russia. They were in Afghanistan. They had occupied and controlled half of Europe. They had downed a Korean airliner the previous year. We were really at really heightened tensions with the Soviet Union. But at that time, Reagan invited Gromyko for talks in Washington. Thatcher invited the next generation, Gorbachev, to discussions in Chequers. Those politicians at that time realized the importance that no matter how difficult the tensions, they needed to continue to engage and to look
no one's questioning this, though. What we don't want, Daniel, is people like you excusing the war crimes that are taking place in Aleppo, the human rights abuses that are taking place in Ukraine and Crimea. It's having someone in the British Parliament who seems to represent the Kremlin more than the British people. And that's a disgrace.
Just, it's just typically because you're losing the argument. You try to cast people like me in the malign way. It's very bad, and it's bad for democracy. We need this debate. We need this debate. By the way, can I just say there are growing numbers now of Conservative MPs who are joining this thought process about the importance of engaging with Russia.
No one is disputing dialogue. You're shooting at a false target.
And on that, Daniel Kawczynski, thank you very much for joining us today.